Okay, hello everybody. My name's Greg Waring, and I'm Verco's project manager for the ALDREN Project. This webinar that I'm going to present today is about how to use the protocol and the tools which are associated with task 2.3 of the ALDREN Project, which is focused on addressing the gap between calculated and actual energy performance. This webinar follows on from a previous webinar which was presented by my colleague Robert Cohen, and in that earlier webinar he introduced the protocol itself and explained its content and what it's all about. So I won't be spending much time on the protocol at all in this presentation. This is much more about the interaction between the protocol and the tools that support it, and a walkthrough of the tools themselves. So in terms of of what I intend to cover today, we'll start off with just a couple of slides about the protocol, which just refreshes the memory from the previous webinar and how it interacts directly with the tools. I'll take a look at the general tool structure, which is common to both of the tools we've developed. And then I'll do a walkthrough of the first tool, the protocol tracking tool, and then a walkthrough of the second tool. And then we'll have a little bit of time to take any questions at the end. Okay, so in terms of the refresher of the protocol is a written document which contains several sections. It's got an introduction and background to explain why the protocol steps are necessary in order to reduce the performance gap, and explain some of the work that's being done in across Europe and in other countries in this area. And the main body of the document is to detail the 18 specific tasks which are part of this module of the ALDREN process, and they're spread across the 5 ALDREN renovation stages. So that takes the building all the way from the initial concept and decision stage about the renovation all the way through to the building in use. And it includes technical guidance and links to related documents for any methodologies which have been adopted and adapted. In terms of how the protocol actually looks, here's an example of a task presented in the protocol. So the key features are that every task has a written description. Existing methodologies that have been adopted or adapted are flagged in the description. Reference materials are highlighted, some of which are provided within the document, some of which are links to other documents. And finally, and this is particularly key, there are direct links to the tools themselves. So you can see in the highlighted section of the text there are table references between the written document and the PVT, the verification tool in this particular case. So that's all I'll say about the protocol itself. The 2 tools that are provided are both constructed in Microsoft Excel. We've tried to make them quite easy to navigate and quite intuitive. The first tool is the protocol tracking tool, which is a project management tool so that the person managing the ALDREN process can record their progress against each task as they work their way through the different project stages. So it's quite a simple one. The performance verification tool is a little bit more complicated. It's still fairly simple as far as software goes, but it's to collect energy performance data. So it's a more quantitative tool that actually produces some results and outputs for the verification process. And we will show you as we go through this presentation how to use that tool and how those outputs are produced. Okay, so in terms of the general structure of the 2 tools, first of all, this image at the top shows the navigation bar, and that's common to both of the tools. And it's a clickable navigation bar, so you can just click on one of the shapes and it will take you straight through to that page of the workbook. There's a worksheet for each of the ALDREN stages in each tool, and then the verification tool also has some outputs worksheets that are navigated the same way. Both tools have a welcome page, which you can get to by clicking on the ALDREN logo. That sets out what each of the worksheets is for and some sort of background information, how to use the tool. And the verification tool has translation into the 6 languages of the ALDREN consortium. That can be selected on the welcome page, and I will show you how to do that as we walk through. Okay, so that's all the introduction. We'll move on to doing a walkthrough of the actual tools themselves. So starting off with the simpler tool, the tracking tool. As I said, this is a project management tool. It acts as a live record of the project's progress throughout the different stages of design and construction. And it provides summaries of the tasks and space to record progress against those. So let's take a look at the tool itself. This is the welcome page of the tool. And as I mentioned, the sort of key features, there's a little bit of introduction to the tool. There is an overview of the different worksheets, just providing a description of what each worksheet is for. There's a key to the color coding of the cells, which helps to identify which cells are for the user inputs and which cells are information. And finally, the arrangement between REBA project stages and the ALDREN stages is also showed here. That's also repeated in the protocol document as well. In terms of the navigation, as you can see, if I click on the different shapes at the top of the screen, that takes me to that appropriate sheet, and there's a black boundary which shows up on the top bar so that you can see which page you're on. So hopefully that will be very intuitive and easy to navigate for all the users. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of the other sheets in the tool. The first sheet is called ALDREN intervention points, and this diagram, this sort of flowchart, shows the different tasks, calculations which are undertaken at different stages of the ALDREN process, including the 2 particularly key stages around calibrating the model for the existing building before the renovation is undertaken, and the verification stage, the crucial verification stage at the InUse stage after the renovation is complete. This way of presenting the project is common between all the different documents for this task. And again, you'll see it's actually, you can navigate from this sheet as well. So we try to put as many navigation links in as we can to make getting around the document very easy. I think that's all we need to say on that sheet. So I'll move on to the task index. This is, again, primarily for easy navigation within the tool, but in this case we list each of the 18 individual tasks, and these are all common with the protocol. And if you were to click on a task, it will take you to that, straight to that respective task. So it's another way of navigating through the document. Okay, so if we move on to one of the actual sheets within the tool, this is the sheet for the decision stage, and you'll see it's very simple. There's just a table with a number of columns and a space. So this pink cell here is the data entry cell, and that's where the completion notes for the task are input by the project manager. So to look at the columns that are provided, we have the task number, the name of the task. It identifies whether or not the tasks are mandatory or an optional task, because there are 2 routes through the process for task 2.3. So it will highlight which of the routes a task sits in and whether or not it's a minimum requirement. There's a brief description, which is an abridged version of the longer explanation in the protocol itself. The primary purpose of the task, so what is it trying to achieve, is included. The party who initiates the task is identified, and also the participants who are likely to be involved. And in the very early stages, some of those participants or stakeholders in the building might not actually be known, so that's been flagged in that first task that they should be involved if they're available. Okay, so I think that's really all we need to present in terms of how to use this tool. As the project manager works through the ALDREN process, they document their progress against each task in the pink boxes, and eventually they will end up with a tool that is complete and provides a long-term reference and audit trail for everything that's been done. So I will minimize that one, and the next tool we will look at is the performance verification tool. And you'll see that the structure is very similar, but this is now the quantitative tool with some analysis included. So here we are on the welcome page of the performance verification tool. The first thing to flag is the language selector here. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got 6 languages available in this tool, and simply by picking the appropriate language in the drop down, that will translate that into any of those 6 languages. We normally expect that just to be used at the start of the project to suit the primary language of an individual project, but if you've got a multilingual project team, that might also help for different people to understand the tool as well as possible. Apart from that, the welcome page is quite similar to the welcome page in the other tool. We have a key for the cell color coding. In this case, we have some slight difference, some different input cells, because some inputs are in drop-down format, so they're limited drop-downs rather than direct text or number inputs. We also have the description of the worksheets, which is the same format as the previous tool. A key difference is we also have a set of definitions in this tool, which just explain the definitions of aspects of the common language used throughout this throughout the verification process, some of which are potentially sort of new terms for the industry, so the definitions are included there. And finally, we have the relationship between ALDREN stages and the REBA plan of work again. Okay, so that's the welcome page. As we said, if you can get back to it by clicking on the ALDREN logo here. Moving through the tool, the next sheet is exactly the same, ALDREN intervention points. So that's you'll find that's the same as the protocol tracking tool and is navigatable again. So if we take a look at one of the actual data entry sheets, this is the first of those sheets, the decision stage. So this is before the renovation project proceeds, when the project team are thinking about what they might want to do. All the sheets have a sheet description at the top, just to give an introduction to what that stage of the process is about. And then in terms of the data entry fields, at this stage, we have a few different types of data entry. We've got some general data entry, which is things like the type of building, the floor area, the data period that the data is going to be entered for, details to do with the EVC rating score of the building before renovation, and there's some space for entering weather data in degree days format to keep track of the weather conditions used in the modelling. Then there's also an input sheet to describe how the building is used. So it's called functional spaces, but it's, this would have a breakdown of offices, common parts, retail space, and any other uses of space, and information on the areas of those spaces and how they're used in terms of hours per year. I'll show you an example of that completed a little bit later in the presentation. And then finally, the all-important energy data entries. These tables currently just have some dummy data in to make the next sheet show some results. But the key things to flag here are that the energy data in this tool can be entered at whole building level or at end use level. When it's entered at end use level, this is where we get the specific insight into building performance, which really drives a verification process, and it allows us to also focus the outputs of the calculations on the energy end uses that are within scope of the EVC calculation. However, the tool is capable of collecting end use level data for every end use in the 2 building types within the ALDREN project, which are offices and hotels. The categories of end use are slightly different in each case because they've been aligned with slightly different methodologies in terms of separating the scope between what's effectively the landlord and the occupant energy uses in each case. And that's documented in the protocol as well. Okay, so I think that's all on that in terms of the general information about the data inputs. If we move on to an example of one of the output sheets, this is the decision stage results. This is all filled with dummy data at the moment, so these aren't real results, but we'll look at some real ones in a moment. But the key points to flag on these sheets is that they can compare the predicted energy consumption, which is generally simulation models in the method, and the measured or metered data, which is actually being taken from meters in the building, in order to understand what the gap in performance is. The data is entered, again, as it's been entered at whole building and end use level. The results are presented at those 2 resolutions. And the results are presented in tables with the absolute values in kilowatt hours, but also the normalized values in kilowatt hours per meter squared for the appropriate floor area for that building type, and also as the variance between the 2 values in kilowatt hours per meter squared, and also in percentage. The percentage variances are then color coded as a rapid to give a rapid indication of how good the match is, to allow the user to rapidly focus on the aspects of the building's performance where the performance gap is bigger. And those color codes are explained with a key on the sheet. If we look at the end use level results, in this case, the table is presented in exactly the same way, but only the end uses that fit within the EVC are color coded on the variance table, just to make it easier to highlight those and focus on those in the assessment, as those are the core target areas for the ALDREN project. But we do present the results for other end uses which fall outside the EVC scope. And finally, just to flag that those results are also presented graphically as well. In practice, you'll see a real example in a moment. Not all the end use categories would be used in most buildings, so these charts become a bit simpler and easier to read. Okay, finally on this sheet we have monthly end use level results, and I'll show you a real example of this. This is a more detailed output which is related to the detailed simulation work which would be undertaken under the route which uses advanced simulation techniques, and the key insights that can be achieved here are you can examine the seasonal trends of performance, which can provide helpful insight into understanding not just where the performance gap exists, but actually why the performance gap exists. So it can help with investigating reasons for the differences in individual end uses. As I say, I'll show you a real example in a moment, which hopefully I can demonstrate how you might use that. Okay, so that's all the general principles of this tool presented, and I'll now move on to an example at the InUse stage, so at the end of the project, using real data from one of our pilot studies to show where that data is entered in the tool, and we can have a quick look at the results. So firstly, some general data for the building is entered, and this is actually entered at the work stage because this would be finalized at the practical completion stage of the building when it's been handed over to the owner. And in here I've entered the building type and the net lettable area, which is the floor area for the normalization, and the start date for the data period where the energy use is going to be compared between the prediction and the actual data. There's a little bit of additional supporting information there as well, which has been entered. As we're doing the in-use stage assessment, the energy data and the operational data is actually entered in the in-use stage tab. So I'll move to that one. Here is the example of the functional spaces data input. So this building is an office building. It's quite a simple one. So basically each floor has office accommodation with its respective hours of use, and it's been fully occupied in this case because it's a single occupant. And then there's an additional line for the landlord areas, common parts of the building, so stairwells and such like. I've then entered the heating and cooling degree days for the data period. I've just put the actual examples in here because we're comparing the advanced simulation with the primary purpose for this assessment was to compare the advanced simulation with the measured data. But where all three types of assessment have been undertaken, you can also put in the standardized weather conditions which have been used for the purposes of the an EPC type calculation. And then following on, the whole building data has been entered, and as you can see, as it's now a real example, we're actually only using 3 fuels in the simulation models, which are the first 2 tables, and then in the third table, in the metered consumption, the building actually ended up using a small amount of gas for a kitchen, which hadn't been accounted for in the original modelling. And then we have the energy by end use, so fans, pumps, heating, cooling, etc. And again, you can see that in these tables, the only a small number, approximately half of the end uses are actually being used in this building. So the tables are considerably simpler than the previous example. In order to compile all this data and get it into the correct format for the tool, that work would be undertaken outside of this tool, in particular around the energy simulations. That data has to be calculated using a simulation model and translated into this format for the purpose of the verification process. So the tool isn't able to interface with simulation models or such like that. That would have been too complex for this particular task. So that compilation of data is undertaken externally. So that's the data entry in the InUse sheet. Let's take a look at the results. And now that we've got a real building example, you can see that we've actually only got 3 direct comparisons at the whole building level. We've got electricity consumption, where the variance in this case is 2%. So there's been a very good agreement in the overall electricity consumption between the model and the measured results. And then the other 2 key lines in the table are the heating and cooling energy use. In this case, we see a large variance on the heating and a small variance, a relatively small variance of 23% on the cooling. So at a very high level, that shows us that the performance gap in this case is biggest on the heating. If we were then to move on and look at the end use level results for this building, you can see that the EVC end uses have been highlighted in the variance table, and there are some larger variances within individual end uses, which could be places, for example, a sort of 54% difference in the lighting consumption, which is highlighting areas where the project team could investigate further to understand whether their model has captured all of the variables in practice, and understand better where the performance gaps are originating. And then if we look at the visual representations of the results, you can see now that, as with a real example where fewer end uses are in play, it's much easier to compare between for example, this blue bar is the fan's energy use, and you've now got a sort of a manageable number of colours on the chart, so you can quite readily compare the actual and measured consumption for the different series on the chart. And that example here, this green bar is for the energy use for pumps, which has turned out to be much higher in reality than it was expected in the original modelling. So that would be a key area to look at in more detail to understand why that variance has happened. Finally, I will just quickly touch on the monthly results, because this is an advanced simulation route. The monthly data is produced to show the variance between the simulation model's predictions under actual conditions and the measured consumption under actual conditions. And the interesting lines here, we noted earlier that there was quite a big variance in space heating relative to the predicted consumption, and a slightly smaller variance in the cooling. When you look at the seasonal profile, you can see that the colour coding is indicating much higher heating use in the summer than expected, and lower heating use in the winter than expected. Whereas in the case for the cooling, it's showing higher, so red colour codes give higher consumption in the actual data. It's showing much higher consumption for cooling in the winter, generally speaking, but the summer peak cooling demand is quite close. So that's starting to be some seasonal insights that would drive investigation to understand why that change is happening. So those are the in-use stage results. The final step in this tool is the EVC verification sheet, and this is the sort of key top-level output of the verification process. This presents the comparison between the predicted and the measured results for the building, focused specifically on the EVC end uses. And in order to achieve a verified EVC certificate, the requirement is that all the significant end uses for the measured consumption need to come through within 25% of the predicted performance under actual conditions. A significant end use is defined as an end use that uses over 10% of the overall consumption that's within the scope of the EVC. And the tool calculates out which of the end uses are deemed to be significant and colour codes these in blue. So in this case, fans, space heating and space cooling are the significant end uses for this building. And then highlights the variance between the modelled and the measured consumption for each of those. And as you can see, for fans, the variance is 17%, so that's within the 25% specification. For space heating, it's 49%, which is outside the tolerance and therefore comes up as red. So that's so that end use has failed the verification. and for cooling it's -23%, so that one has passed, so that comes back as a green. Lighting is also an EVC end use, and that one has been color coded as well. As a result of the fact that the space heating has failed the verification process, the EVC verified cell at the bottom has come back as a no and a red color code. So that's how that sheet works. And in order to verify the EVC, it would be necessary, in this case, for the design team to undertake further work to understand why there's this bigger gap between the model and the actual results, and potentially revise the modelling to reflect any issues, any false assumptions that had been made during the modelling process, to understand the operation of the building more clearly, or fine-tune the building to make sure that the controls and the operation of the building fit with the design intent. Okay, that is the end of the walkthrough of the tool. So I hope that has been helpful and is clear to everyone how to make use of these tools in parallel with our protocol document. So that ends the presentation at this stage, and we'd be very happy to take some questions from anybody with regards to how this process works.